Today we're going to the Guggenheim, and there are two exhibits there that are both what you could call post-painterly abstraction. Okay, basically, if you were with me when I did the Alma Thomas talk, I talked a bit about the color field painters and in DC and all that. Well, it was a very broad movement, and so what I'm going to do is spend most of my time focusing on the exhibit called The Fullness of Color from the 1960s. I'll spend a lot of time on Helen Frankenthaler, who was very influential on that movement. But let's get started. So these are the layouts for the exhibitions. So I'm going to go forward, and so these are two shots inside the gallery. You can see the scale of the pieces in this. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to show these shots, so you could see the size of these pieces. Scale was very important to the color field paintings. Don't mind me, I'm going to flip through my notes here. Okay, so here we have Willem de Kooning on the left and Franz Klein on the right. These guys were kind of what they coined as gesture painters. They were, this business of abstract expressionism was a very loose term. It contained a lot of different kinds of abstract painting. So I don't find that a very satisfactory name for what these people did. Now, these two were very much of the kind of Bavura painting school, and a lot of people followed them. There were a lot of people that were painting, had this gestural, painterly, loose approach. The de Koonings are very violent. They're slashing. They're lacerating the body and putting it back together again. Now, I love his paintings, but they are very macho. They're very male, and the symbol of the woman being ripped apart and put back together again is it's kind of provocative. But this label of abstract expressionism is rather dubious to me at this point. Now, these guys were gesture painters. Another name for it was action painting. Okay, there's Action Jackson. There's Jackson Pollock would probably fall more into that category. And here are a couple of really, really subtle Pollock ink paintings. And these were very influential. Helen Frankenthaler was introduced to him, and she went out to Long Island to his studio and saw these pieces, saw him working on the floor and doing the drip paintings that he did and pouring the paint on and all of that. That really affected her, because before that she had been working on the easel and working with abstraction, but not the effect of seeing these pieces on her was very profound. So what I'm going to do is go to this, and Mountains and Sea. So the color field painters were and I would say that she is a color field painter, are more descendants of Matisse than of Picasso. Um, you know, there are elements of the Picassoid business going on in Mountains and Sea, where there's a kind of chopping up of the landscape and putting back together, but it's really much more about the interaction of color. It's much more about that. You're going to hear a lot about interaction of color. I'm going to play around with that word a lot. So basically, what she got out of seeing Pollock was the idea of laying out the canvas on the floor and working on it flat and working, you know, basically pouring the paint in and moving it around in different ways than using a brush. So much of this was poured and from buckets, and she would use sticks, she would use different implements to make marks, sponges, rollers, all kinds of stuff. Her hands, you know, just get right inside the painting and move the paint around. So let's see. Now, one of the things that happened was, now this is a much later painting, but you can still see the business of the drip. Now, you know, in this, she's starting to integrate more of the linear elements into it. So there's a little more control, but you can see that there are these puddles and poolings, and some of them have more control than others. Some of them are actually, you know, you can see some brush strokes and things like that in some areas. But it's more about the staining, how it goes into the canvas. Now, by this time in '95, she was using acrylic. What she started out with in those early pieces was, let's see, these are oil paint. So, you know, basically it would go into the fibers of the cloth a lot more than what happens with the acrylics. The acrylics tend to stay more on the surface. You can do more even pours and things like that with the acrylic. And okay, so, you know, they're also playful. This is called Flirt, for crying out loud. Okay, all right, and you know, you can see that there's these large fields of color. It's large areas of color. Big, broad areas interacting. They do have referential business going on them. They're kind of landscapey. They have to do with that. Many of the other color field painters kind of leave natural reference behind, but you know, there's no rules on all this. And then there's Hans Hoffman, who actually Helen Frankenfaller studied with for a brief period of time, but she was married to Motherwell, Robert Motherwell, and they had a place out in Provincetown. So she studied with Hoffman for a short period of time, but they were also neighbors. And one of the quotes from her, I'm gonna mash this up because she had a much more sly way of putting things, but when she saw this painting, she, you know, at 75, I mean, Hoffman stopped teaching and started to paint full time. And this is one of his late paintings. This is from, I think, 61 or something like that. He lived to 66. And this was kind of like showing those color field stain painters how to do it. Now, you know, on the right, we have Mark Rothko, obviously a color field painter, okay? And you know, what does color field mean? All right, that's something that might be useful to talk a little bit about. You know, color as field, it really is about these large areas of color, of more or less flat color. Now, you know, there's texture, there's layering, there's all kinds of things going on especially with Rothko. He would work these things up, and there's layer upon layer of paint, but basically it's large areas of color with certain edges showing and things like that, which is, it's really wonderful and dynamic. Are there any questions?
Yes, there's 2 questions.
Okay.
How much time would a painting like these take to make?
The Rothko could take as many as 3 or 4 months to develop. He would do them and he would put them aside. The Hoffman is a one-shot deal. But we're talking about 60 years of experience and 3 or 4 hours of work. So if you're going to hit it, you hit it. So.
Got it. And someone asked, was Fairfield Porter a color field painter?
Not at all. He's a wonderful painter and a brilliant critic who actually had a great appreciation for everything that was going on in the art world at the time. And he actually was a critic and wrote critiques of the color field painters. So he was aware of everything that was going on. And of course, he drank it in and integrated it into what he was doing, but he's a very different animal. He really does fall into a kind of new realist painting category. But good question. His stuff is very fresh, so I can understand why you would think of that. Okay, so now we're on to Morris Louis. Now, Morris Louis and Kenneth Nolan were 2 young painters. Well, they weren't that young, but they were young-ish painters who were introduced to Frankenfaller by Clement Greenberg, who was a very influential art critic at the time. He saw their work and he knew that she was onto something that they'd be interested in. So he brought them up to New York City and basically, actually, I believe he brought them into her studio when she wasn't there. So they got to see what she was up to. They saw mountains and sea, and they saw some of the new things that she was working on the floor. And it was great, inspiration to them. They were like, oh my God, this is what I want to do. Now, if you look at this big piece, you can see the pour. What he would do is he would angle his loose canvases so they were not stretched when he did these. So he would angle them up and he would do these pours of acrylic paint over them. And I'm gonna actually do a detail shot here. I'm gonna zoom in so you can see some of the luscious textures that are happening here. And look at the reticulation and the veils of color. So what he would do is he would do pours, and then he would let them dry in between, and then he would do another pour over it and things like that. And he was using, they started using acrylic paint when it was kind of brand new. This was in the early 60s, I believe. It might have been in the late 50s when they started doing these. And basically they were using something called Magna acrylics, which were sort of a little different body than the heavy body acrylics that we use nowadays, but still in all, they're pretty interesting surface that he would get out of this. And you can see the veils, you can see the layering of this stuff, and they're just really beautiful color. Okay, and these are a couple more of his pieces where he's letting them be isolated and letting the raw canvas show through. Oh, that's another thing. These are all on raw canvas. They are not primed, so that the paint can soak into the surface of the canvas. The Magna had sort of a shiny quality to it. So when it was on there really thick, it would have a kind of shiny, tactile quality. The one on the left is in the Museum of Modern Art. I'm not sure where the one on the right is, but I think it might be at the National, or no, it's at the Guggenheim. Come to think of it, it's in this show. Okay, and here we have Sam Gilliam, who is another DC-based painter, and he saw what was going on with these guys and said, that's interesting. Well, why the heck are you stretching them? So he started to experiment with doing these pours and doing these splatters and doing these drips on the raw canvas, and then knotting and hanging them into the environment. And this is a big piece. I mean, it's 140 by 185 by 16 inches sticking out from the wall. Interesting, painter. These three stayed in DC. They knew what was going on in New York, but they stayed in DC. They showed in New York, and this right here is a large-scale piece that is up at Dia Beacon right now. This piece is installed there, and definitely worth going up to see. I'm gonna push forward here a little bit because I gotta look a little bit. Oh yeah, okay. So these pieces come out into the room, and you can go inside them and be inside the painting. Really interesting stuff. This was done in 1969. So there are talks by Gilliam on YouTube. Some of them are a little hard to follow, but that's okay. They're interesting to check out. I'll have some references at the end, of course. But he was an interesting guy. Wasn't selling a lot, so at the time he could afford to experiment. There was a patron who actually paid for some studio space for him to work in. So he and a couple of other painters had the freedom to just do whatever they wanted to do. So he would just take these big old rolls of canvas and just go at it. He would put paint on and then go out to the movies and come back and see what happened. Okay. And Kenneth Nolan. Okay. So one of the other ideas that these guys had was one of limiting the form that they worked in so that they could really home in and explore the color possibilities. So they would simplify their more or less subject matter. Where Morris Louis was sticking with those drips, those lines, those pores on his pieces, and he would drape them differently and fold them in different ways and things like that. Where Nolan did these targets or lines or something which he would call the chevrons. I'll show you some of those in a little while, but the idea was so they didn't have to think too much about composition, but could concentrate more on the color. So that aspect of things was not something that was troubling them. Whereas somebody like Frankenfaller was constantly thinking about what she was doing with her compositions. Those were very much, something that she was dealing with in those situations with a great deal of authority and assurance, but she did not eliminate that as an element that she had to deal with. So that I thought that was an interesting idea. Look what time it is. Okay, gotta keep rolling. Okay, and then other painters of this group moved from doing pours and doing staining to using sprays. So there was another way of mark making that wasn't about your hand being in there, a brush making the mark, so that it was less an imposition as it was a breathed on quality. Let me move on to Olitsky. Yeah, there we go. Again, these transitions, you can see the splatters and different quality of paint being put on there. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can kind of see a section of it. Okay. So you can see the splatters and the layers and the interaction of how the color is when it goes over different layers of areas of the canvas. So he was very much, this guy especially was very much involved in what was happening with the surface of the canvas, how the paint was going on there, what it did when it went on. And also this business of the edge where, he's very conscious of what he was doing. This one, not as much as some of the others, but very much there. And you can see these markings, very subtle markings in the surface. This is really, they're calling it post-painterly painting, post-painterly abstraction. So, where the paint was applied with a brush, they consider that to be a painterly painting. And this is more about layering and how the paint granulates, what it does as it interacts, and really what the color is all about. It's really large open fields, and he experimented a lot with those surfaces. Some of his paintings got really, really thick later on, very heavy impastos, thick acrylic paint, with broad open areas in the center, and most of the activity concentrated on the edges. Interesting. Okay. And Alma Thomas, okay, very musical, really wonderful This one, you know, basically it's really concentrating on primary and secondary colors, um, um, nature references. You know, the one on the left is called Cherry Blossoms. The one on the right is really, you know, I mean, basically it's very floral, but it's also, you know, this business of increments of mark making as a very limited um, approach, limiting the marks, keeping the marks distinct, but they're really delightful paintings. You know, one of the reasons why I really wanted to stick with this stuff, not all the pieces that I'm showing you are in the show, but the one on the left is. They're just really just delightful color experiences. So I figured, you know, hey, I'm going to keep it light this week. All right. And it was really this color field thing was an international school, really. I mean, Sam Francis was an American painter. He spent 7 years in Paris, so he was very influenced by that. And there's a French Canadian painter called Riopol who he was good friends with, and also he was friends with Joan Mitchell. So they all knew each other and they were friendly at that time. And you can see, you know, the openness of this, and it's really about the interaction of color. It's about these open areas and open fields. It's very Oriental, very Asian in its orientation. He also lived in Japan for a number of years. He had a home in Japan and a home in California. So he would travel back and forth between Japan and California because his sensibility really went that way. But all of these guys had this kind of openness, this kind of, they wanted the lyricism of the canvas to be part of their paintings. Big piece, 90 by 160 inches. And that's another important thing. A lot of these pieces are very large scale. Now, Joan Miro, who I think many of you may know his work. Miro's work was very organic. It was very much came out of the surrealist background into abstraction. And these later pieces are really color field paintings. They're organic, you know, this bird-like flying creature across the bottom, but still in all, it's really about these beautiful, crazy, lyrical, wacky, zany shapes skittering across the surface. But this saturated color in there is very much, you know, something that the color field painters would have been aware of. And on the right is Robert Motherwell. Now, you know, Motherwell and Frankenfaller were married from 1958 to 1971. And so they, you know, were cross-pollinating all the time. There's literally, they were, you know, interacting and talking to each other, and you know, the ideas were definitely in there. Let's see. Okay, and then there's this guy. Matisse is really kind of the father of a lot of this stuff in a way. Let me see. I want to move this thing if I can. All right. Well, let me do this. I'm going to zoom in and come over here and actually go like this, so you can see, you know, the
Larry?
staining. Yes.
I was just going to say, while you're doing that, somebody says, honestly, this is so little art compared to Vermeer. What makes them so special before Matisse?
Okay. Well, all right. If you think about this, they're really simplifying the form, so that it's really about the experience of color. It is not a narrative. It is not the classical traditional the classical tradition of Western painting in the sense of what the Dutch Golden Age was about. It's not about that. It's about something different. It's about the interaction of color. And it's about allowing yourself to just experience what these things are about at this stage of the game. Now, you may not like it. That's fine. It's everyone to their own taste. But for me, there's a joy in these paintings that is really not inhibited by a narrative. So, you know, that's just kind of where we are with this. And I'm not trying to sell you on on color field painters, but I love them, and I think there's something there. All right, let's see. Okay. So basically, the simplified forms and pure bright stained color were cues that these guys picked up on from Matisse. Okay, and this is a Motherwell. Now, I'm gonna go back to that Matisse from Notre Dame. Let me see. Okay, and you can see this is Notre Dame, and the underlying structures. There's all this underdrawing that's going on in here. And again, simplified, pared down. This is really about the surface of that canvas. And Motherwell, again, picked up on that. If you look up here in that blue area, you can see those linear elements, and this is really Motherwell, giving us a little cue. He's leaving a clue behind. He loved Matisse, and basically, one of the things that Matisse did was limit his colors in a way that made that sing. It made it more and more about those few colors. And so, somebody like Motherwell was picking up on that and carrying it forward. Okay. So again, this was a truly international school. The Jack Bush was a Canadian painter, but he picked up on what was going on with this color field business, with the beautiful surfaces and patterns. He kind of abstracted from things that he'd see in a shop window or something like that, and picked out these forms. Now, they are, again, very large scale. Oh, okay, I'm going to go back. Previous. They're very large scale. This is 70 by 55. The one on the see, that's one of the things that's very powerful about these pieces is the scale. You get inside these paintings when you actually see them. On screen, they're small, they're nice designs, pretty colors, but when you see them in person, the impact is much greater. So that is really something that was emphasized by these guys.
Larry?
Yes.
Did the artists mix their colors or just use them out of the can?
They mixed their own colors. They often used them pretty much full strength, but if you look at some of these colors, they were mixtures that they would make before they would go to the pour. And this is one of the chevrons from Nolan. And maybe I should close in on this too, so you can actually, maybe you can see the surface a little bit more. Let's see. It doesn't give you too much of a sense of it. All right. And now we go into Joseph Albers. Now, Albers was one of Nolan's teachers, and he was very influential. He came out of the Bauhaus, which was a school in Germany, pre-war Germany, experimental painters, Kandinsky, Paul Klee, many of the avant-garde painters were teachers at the school. And it was really about, paring down things, getting to a kind of what Albers called the interaction of color. Okay, and the interaction of color is really contextualizing color. It's isolating the elements of things so that they're pared down. And what happens with these things is when you can see certain things that happen with the glow around these pieces. If you stare at them for a long enough period of time, they start to glow in different ways. He would also take the same color and put it in different contexts. I don't have any of those right here. It's a little bit hard to see on screen, but these paintings they're not big. These are 24 by 24, but they're not as flat as they appear to be. Let's see if I can zoom in. There's really a beautiful texture. How he applied the paint was very, very intentional. It has a really tactile. He would put it on with a brush and then scrape it with a knife to get this kind of mottled surface. And they're really luscious paintings when you see them in person.
Larry, are they
Yes.
supposed to be an optical illusion?
Oh yes, they are very much involved in optics. What happens with the ones that are really magic is he'll take the same color and put it in different contexts, like the same square in the center on different fields of color, and they will appear totally different.
We have another question. Is
Yes.
Sonia Delaney considered to be a color field painter? And what other women painters could be included?
Very good question. Sonia Delaney was, they called them synchronists. Robert and Sonia Delaney created a whole school of painting called synchronists. And do they come into that category? No, because they're really precursors of all of this. Do they influence these people? Yes, absolutely. They were very influential on people like Albers. They were Hans Hoffman knew them well, so they influenced him, and he was a great influence on all these guys too. A lot of painters studied with him, and so he was good friends with Sonia Delaney, and loved her work and was influenced by her. So yes, good question. Love Sonia Delaney. Okay, and this guy. I didn't know his work before I started to explore this stuff. And you know, my wife and I were watching, Sonia and I were watching some of the videos preparing for this, and we saw you know, his work included in some of the shows. Now, he died in 1966. He had a retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum, and he also had a show recently, like in 2014, up at the Albright Knox Museum. He's in a lot of the collections, but I never heard of Paul Feely. I don't know who he is. It turns out, you know, basically he came up through the 30s. He was born in 1910 and died in 66. So he was a relatively young man, you know, 56 years old, not real old. He came up through the Depression and was a member of the WPA painters. So he was actually doing some of the murals. If you were with me when we went through the mural painters, he was one of the guys who was there. So he did these big figurative murals. They were really wonderful, very well done. But he evolved into these wonderful color field pieces. These are very funny. You know, the one on the left is called Kilroy. You know, the nose of Kilroy was here. Now, it's a big piece. It's 101 by 90 inches. That's a pretty enormous piece. The one on the right is a jack. You know, you play jacks, the little twirly thing. Well, that's what he used for his thing. Now, what these pieces are about is this business of figure ground. Okay, the activity of the design, how both the shape that's painted and the shape around it interact. Very important to these people and very involved. You know, that's what a lot of what his work is about. But also really beautiful color sensibility. I mean, this is lovely.
Larry?
Yes.
What other women artists could be included in this category?
There's well, Alma Thomas, of course. There's Truitt. Can't remember what her first name is now, but she was a sculptor. There was another woman, and I can't remember what her name was now. And let's see who else. Well, there were others. There were some based in New York that would basically be influenced or come into this category. I would say that somebody like Elizabeth Murray was influenced by this work, though I wouldn't include her as a color field painter. She cut her teeth in the 60s and was somebody who was very influenced by abstract shape painting. Okay, let's see. I'm going to move along here. All right, we're getting there. All right, I'm gonna keep moving here because we're running out of time. Let's see. Okay. So, you know, Gene Davis, that very intuitive. He would start these things from one side and work his way across to the other. You know, these are very optical, these pieces. They're very much about you know, the optical effects of these linear elements. Let's see. Next. Okay. And then the other show is called Marking Time. It's process in minimal abstraction. And basically, you know, one of the things that was going on is a reaction to the complexity of the abstract expressionists. You know, there was so much going on in those paintings. And the other thing that was happening was pop art was going on at the same time. So these guys were reacting off of that. And I'm going to keep going. They're very meditative pieces. These are very much more about process for the painter. And they're very slow paintings. They're things that you need to sit and look at for a while to kind of get what they're all about. These are a couple of Agnes Martin pieces. Again, very subtle pieces. In this case, the reproductions don't do you any good because basically you need to kind of feel your way across these pieces, and there's a lot going on in them, but you can't see it in reproduction so well. And I am going to keep moving. She was very much involved in meditation, in Zen meditation. So there's a repetition in these things, like a mantra. The grid, the graph was something that was very much part of what she was about. Let's see. And these are Bryce Martin pieces. He's moved on to some very big, luscious abstractions but this was his beginnings. All right, so let's see. And here is Frankenfaller in front of one of her big paintings. There is a wonderful talk that's through the Ninel collection, and I've got the link there, and also below is Jessica Bell Brown up at Dia Beacon on the Sam Gilliam installation that's up in Dia. So that covers it. That's it for this week. Next week, we're going to be going to the Barnes collection, and there's a wonderful wacky exhibit on there, and they have some really terrific paintings. I'll spend a lot of time with Cézanne, which I always like to do. So that's it for this week, unless there are any more questions.
There are no questions, Larry.
Okay.
So we're good. So
okay.
More thank yous, and love your talks because they're so thought-provoking. So
great.
Lots of thoughts. So thank you all. Thanks, Larry.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right, we'll see you next Friday.